the silent stalker of Hinterkaifeck. The wind howled across the desolate fields of Hinterkaifeck, carrying with it the biting chill of late winter. The small, isolated farmstead stood like a dark silhouette against the overcast sky, its walls groaning under the relentless force of the wind. Inside, the Gruber family huddled around the dim glow of the fireplace, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. It was March 31st, 1922, a day that would forever be seared into the annals of horror. Yet, for the Grubers, it was just another day filled with the mundane tasks of farm life, feeding the animals, tending to the crops, and keeping the cold at bay. But a creeping unease had settled over the household, one that was impossible to ignore. It had started weeks ago when Andreas Gruber, the patriarch of the family, had discovered a strange set of footprints in the snow. They led from the dense woods at the edge of their property straight to the back door of the house. What chilled Andreas to his core, however, was that the footprints stopped there. No tracks led back into the woods or anywhere else. It was as if whoever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. Andreas had searched the property, rifle in hand, but found nothing. No sign of an intruder, no disturbance in the snow. The rest of the family brushed it off as a trick of the light or a figment of his imagination. But Andreas knew better. Something was out there. Something that had been watching them. The days passed, and the sense of dread only grew. The family began to hear strange noises at night. Soft, almost imperceptible whispers in the walls, the creak of floorboards in the dead of night, and the sound of something heavy dragging across the attic floor. Andreas had searched the attic more times than he could count, but it was always empty. That night, as the fire crackled weakly in the hearth, the Gruber family sat in tense silence. Andreas stared into the flames, his mind replaying the events of the past few weeks over and over again. His wife Kazilia busied herself with knitting, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. Their daughter Victoria sat beside her, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Even the young children, little Kazilia and Joseph, seemed unusually quiet, their wide eyes reflecting the flickering light. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the house, causing everyone to jump. The sound had come from the attic. Andreas was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed the rifle that was always within arm's reach and motioned for the others to stay put. "I'll check it out," he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he made his way to the ladder that led to the attic. The house was deathly silent now, the only sound the faint crackling of the fire behind him. With each step, the knot of fear in his stomach tightened. As he reached the top of the ladder, Andreas hesitated. The darkness of the attic seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing the feeble light from his lantern. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and stepped into the gloom. The attic was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. Andreas swept the lantern from side to side, illuminating the familiar shapes of old furniture, boxes, and forgotten trinkets. But nothing seemed out of place. Then, just as he was about to turn back, he heard it. A soft, almost inaudible rustling coming from the far corner of the attic. Andreas froze, his heart racing. He could feel the sweat trickling down the back of his neck as he slowly turned toward the sound. And there, in the shadows, he saw it, an outline barely visible in the darkness. It was human-shaped but twisted, hunched over, as if it didn't quite belong in this world. Andreas's breath caught in his throat as he realized it was staring right at him, its eyes glinting with a malevolent intelligence. Before he could react, the figure moved, swiftly, silently, and the lantern flickered out, plunging the attic into pitch blackness. Downstairs, the rest of the family heard a single, blood-curdling scream, and then, nothing. The scream echoed through the house, reverberating off the walls until it finally died out, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Downstairs, the Gruber family sat frozen in place, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the ragged breathing of Kazilia, who clutched little Joseph tightly to her chest, her knuckles white. It was Victoria who broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Father, we have to go to him." But no one moved. The oppressive fear that had gripped the family over the past weeks now held them paralyzed, as if something unseen was holding them in place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kazilia nodded, her resolve hardening. "Victoria, take the children and stay here. I'll go." Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but Kazilia cut her off with a sharp look. The older woman grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and headed toward the ladder to the attic, her heart pounding in her chest. The children huddled closer to Victoria, their small bodies shaking with fear. Kazilia took a deep breath and began to ascend the ladder, the poker held tightly in her hands. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, and the darkness above seemed to swallow the dim light from the fire below. When she reached the top, she hesitated, her heart hammering in her chest. But there was no turning back now. "Dear God," she whispered to herself as she stepped into the attic. The darkness was absolute. She could barely make out the shapes of old furniture and forgotten belongings that cluttered the space. The silence was so thick it felt as if the air itself was pressing down on her. "Where are you, Andreas?" she called out, her voice trembling as it echoed in the empty space. There was no answer, only the soft creaking of the house settling around her. She took another step forward, then another, her eyes straining to see anything in the pitch-black void. Then a faint sound reached her ears, a soft rhythmic scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. The noise sent a chill down her spine, and she instinctively raised the poker, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking with fear. The scraping stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Kazilia stood motionless, her senses on high alert, every nerve in her body screaming for her to flee. But she couldn't. Something compelled her to move forward, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. As she edged closer to the source of the sound, she noticed a faint glimmer in the darkness, a reflection of light off something metallic. She squinted, trying to make it out, when suddenly the floor beneath her feet gave way with a loud crack. She stumbled forward, catching herself just in time to avoid falling into a large, gaping hole in the floorboards. She peered into the hole, her heart racing. It was a trapdoor she hadn't noticed before, leading down into a hidden compartment beneath the attic floor. The metallic glimmer she'd seen came from something inside the compartment, something that gleamed dully in the faint light from the hole. But that wasn't what terrified her. What made her blood run cold was the sight of Andreas, lying motionless at the bottom of the compartment, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the void, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. Kazilia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she stumbled back from the trapdoor, the poker clattering to the floor. She couldn't tear her eyes away from Andreas, even as her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of that cursed attic. But before she could move, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper right behind her. It was a voice, low and guttural, speaking in a language she didn't understand. Kazilia spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness, deep and impenetrable. But she knew, oh, she knew that she wasn't alone. Something was in the attic with her, something that had been waiting, watching, biding its time. Her heart thundered in her chest as the whisper grew louder, closer, until it was right in her ear. She felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, and then darkness. Downstairs, Victoria and the children waited in agonizing silence, straining to hear any sign of life from the attic. But the house was deathly quiet, the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Then, without warning, the front door of the farmhouse creaked open, the hinges groaning in protest. A gust of icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing the fire and plunging the room into darkness. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She clutched the children tighter, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the open door. The cold wind carried with it a faint scent, something foul, something decayed. Before she could react, a figure stepped through the doorway, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture hunched and unnatural. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step forward, its eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. And then, as if the night itself had come alive, the figure lunged. The darkness was suffocating, wrapping itself around Victoria like a shroud. She could barely see the children clinging to her, their small bodies trembling with fear. The figure that had entered the room loomed in the doorway, its twisted form barely visible in the faint moonlight that filtered through the broken window. It moved with an unnatural grace, a predator stalking its prey, its footsteps almost silent on the wooden floor. Victoria's mind raced, her survival instincts kicking in. She had to protect the children, had to get them out of the house. But how? The only exit was blocked by that thing, whatever it was. A low guttural growl rumbled from the figure, sending a chill down Victoria's spine. She forced herself to move, inching backward toward the kitchen door. If she could just get to the back door, maybe they could escape into the night and find help. "Stay close to me," she whispered to the children, her voice trembling with fear. "Don't make a sound." The figure seemed to sense her plan. It tilted its head slightly, as if listening, and then it took another step forward, its long fingers twitching in anticipation. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She had to act fast. In one swift motion, she pushed the children behind her and grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the kitchen counter. It was the only weapon she had, and she gripped it tightly, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. The figure took another step, its form becoming clearer as it entered the dim light from the dying embers of the fire. Victoria could see it now, a grotesque parody of a human being, its skin pale and stretched tightly over a skeletal frame. Its eyes were deep, hollow sockets, and its mouth twisted into a ghastly grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Victoria's heart raced as she backed toward the kitchen door, her eyes never leaving the creature. She knew she had only one chance, one moment to strike before it pounced. "Run!" she screamed to the children, throwing open the kitchen door and pushing them through. The figure lunged, its speed almost too fast to follow, but Victoria was ready. She swung the skillet with all her might, aiming for the creature's head. The impact was sickening. A crunch of bone and a wet, splattering sound as the skillet connected with the figure's skull. It staggered back, a guttural scream escaping its twisted lips. But it didn't go down. Instead, it seemed to grow more enraged, its eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. Victoria didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran, slamming the kitchen door behind her as she raced to catch up with the children. They were already outside, their small figures barely visible in the darkness. The cold night air hit her like a slap in the face as she burst through the back door and into the yard. The wind howled around them, carrying with it the scent of decay and death. Victoria's mind raced as she tried to think of where they could go. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the woods surrounding the farm were thick and treacherous. "Over here!" she called to the children, leading them toward the barn. It wasn't much, but it would give them some shelter, at least until she could figure out what to do next. They stumbled through the snow, the icy wind biting at their faces. Victoria glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure emerging from the house, but the door remained closed. Had she heard it? Was it lying in wait, ready to strike again? They reached the barn, and Victoria pushed open the heavy wooden doors, ushering the children inside. The air was thick with the smell of hay and animals, and the darkness was almost as oppressive as it had been in the house. But at least here they had walls around them, walls that might keep whatever that thing was at bay. "Stay here," she whispered to the children as she shut the barn doors behind them. "Don't make a sound." The children huddled together in the corner, their eyes wide with fear. Victoria's heart ached as she looked at them, but she knew she couldn't let her fear paralyze her. She had to protect them, no matter what. She grabbed a pitchfork from the wall and stood guard by the door, her eyes scanning the darkness outside through the small, dirty window. The wind howled louder, rattling the barn's old wooden beams, but there was no sign of the figure. Minutes stretched into hours as Victoria stood there, her body tense and her mind racing. Every creak of the barn, every gust of wind, sent a jolt of fear through her. What was that thing? Why had it come for them? And where were Andreas and her mother? The thought of them lying lifeless in the house filled her with a cold dread. But she couldn't afford to think about that now. She had to focus on surviving the night. Just when she began to think they might be safe, a loud bang echoed through the barn, followed by the sound of something, or someone, scratching at the doors. Victoria's heart leaped into her throat as she backed away, raising the pitchfork in front of her. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Victoria held her breath, waiting, listening, every muscle in her body tensed for action. Suddenly, the barn doors exploded inward with a force that sent her flying backward. She hit the ground hard, the pitchfork clattering out of her hands as she struggled to regain her bearings. And then she saw it. The figure standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It stepped into the barn, its twisted form towering over her as it moved closer, its mouth twisting into that same ghastly grin. Victoria scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the barn for something, anything she could use to defend herself. But before she could reach the pitchfork, the figure was upon her, its cold, bony fingers wrapping around her throat, cutting off her scream. The last thing Victoria saw before the darkness took her was the children, huddled together in the corner, their terrified eyes locked onto hers. And then, blackness. The barn was silent, save for the soft rustle of hay and the distant howl of the wind outside. The children, Kazilia and little Joseph, huddled together in the darkest corner, their small bodies trembling with fear as they watched their mother being overpowered by the dark figure. Her desperate gasps for air cut short as the life drained from her eyes. For a long moment, nothing moved. The figure stood over Victoria's lifeless body, its form barely visible in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the barn walls. Then slowly, it turned its head toward the children. Kazilia clutched Joseph tightly, trying to shield him from the creature's gaze, but there was no escaping it. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto them with a predatory focus. It moved forward, its footsteps eerily silent on the straw-covered floor. The children's breath hitched in their throats as the figure approached, its twisted grin widening as it drew nearer. Joseph whimpered, burying his face in Kazilia's shoulder, but she knew there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. This thing, whatever it was, had come for them, just as it had come for their parents. But just as the figure reached out, there was a sudden violent banging on the barn doors. The sound was so loud it reverberated through the entire structure, causing the figure to stop in its tracks. It turned its head toward the door, its grin fading into a snarl. Another bang, and the doors creaked on their hinges, as if something, or someone, was trying to force them open. The figure hesitated, its posture tense, as if it were caught between two desires, to finish what it had started with the children, or to confront whatever was outside. Kazilia took the opportunity to move, grabbing Joseph by the hand and pulling him behind a stack of hay bales. She pressed her hand over his mouth, urging him to stay silent as they crouched low, hidden from view. The banging grew louder, more insistent, and finally, with a deafening crash, the barn doors burst open. A gust of icy wind swept into the barn, extinguishing the few remaining lanterns and plunging the space into near-total darkness. In the doorway stood a man. No, not just a man, but Andreas Gruber, his eyes wild with desperation and terror. His face was pale, his clothes torn and bloodied, but there was no mistaking the resolve in his eyes. The figure let out a guttural hiss, its attention now fully on Andreas. It moved toward him with a speed that seemed impossible, its bony fingers outstretched, ready to strike. But Andreas was ready. He raised a long, sharp scythe, a tool he had grabbed in his desperation, swinging it with all his might. The blade caught the figure across the chest, slicing through its pale skin with a sickening squelch. The figure screamed, a sound so inhuman, so filled with rage and pain, that it made Kazilia's blood run cold. It staggered back, clutching at the wound as a thick black substance oozed from the gash. Andreas didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, swinging the scythe again and again, driving the creature back toward the open doors. With each strike, the figure seemed to lose its form, its body dissolving into the darkness like smoke in the wind. Finally, with one last desperate swing, Andreas struck the figure in the head, and it collapsed to the ground in a heap. The black substance pooled around it, spreading across the floor like spilled ink. For a moment, there was silence. Then the figure twitched, its body convulsing as it tried to rise. But it was too weak, too broken. With one final gurgling breath, it lay still. Andreas stood over the creature, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His eyes scanned the barn, wild and unfocused, until they landed on the hay bales where Kazilia and Joseph were hiding. His expression softened as he dropped the scythe and rushed to them, pulling them into a tight embrace. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse and filled with relief. "It's over." But as he held them close, something caught his eye. Something that made his blood run cold. The black substance that had oozed from the creature's wounds was moving, creeping along the floor like a living thing. It slithered toward the shadows, pooling around the base of the hay bales. Andreas pulled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed Kazilia and Joseph, pushing them toward the barn doors. "Go! Get out of here, now!" But it was too late. The substance began to rise, taking shape, forming into something new. Something even more horrifying than the figure Andreas had just fought. It stretched upward, growing taller, its form more solid, more defined. Andreas watched in horror as the new figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. It was no longer just a twisted parody of a human being. It was something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The figure's mouth twisted into a smile, and it spoke, its voice a low, rumbling growl that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. "You cannot kill what has never lived." Andreas staggered back, his mind reeling with terror. He knew deep down that there was no escape from this. The thing before him was beyond anything he could comprehend, beyond life, beyond death. It was a force of pure evil, and it had been waiting for him. As the figure advanced, Andreas made one last, desperate attempt to protect his children. He pushed them behind him, raising the scythe once more, but his hands were trembling, his strength fading. The figure laughed, a deep mocking sound that sent shivers down Andreas's spine. It reached out, its fingers elongating into sharp, talon-like claws, and with one swift motion, it slashed through the air. Andreas felt a searing pain in his chest as the claws tore through him, but he didn't cry out. His only thought was of his children, of protecting them. Even as the darkness closed in around him, he fell to his knees, the scythe slipping from his grasp as his vision blurred. The last thing he saw was the figure looming over him, its glowing eyes filled with a malevolent glee. And then, nothing. The barn was silent once more, save for the soft rustle of hay and the distant howl of the wind outside. The children, Kazilia and little Joseph, were huddled in the shadows, their eyes wide with terror as they watched their father fall. The figure, now fully formed and more terrifying than ever, stood over Andreas's lifeless body, its twisted smile growing wider. For a moment it seemed to relish the quiet, as if savoring the fear that hung thick in the air. Then slowly, it turned its head toward the children, its eyes glowing with that sickly yellow light. It was time to finish what it had started. Kazilia held Joseph tightly, trying to shield him as best she could. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing for a way out. But the barn was sealed shut behind them, and there was no one left to help. She could feel the figure's gaze on her, could almost taste the malevolence radiating from it. But then, something strange happened. The figure paused, its smile fading as it tilted its head, almost as if listening to something only it could hear. The barn's air grew colder, more oppressive, and the shadows around them seemed to deepen. For a brief, flickering moment, the figure seemed to waver, its form blurring at the edges, as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. Kazilia noticed it too, and for the first time, a flicker of hope ignited within her. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the flicker died. The figure solidified once more, its malevolent grin returning. It took a step forward, its claws extending as it prepared to strike. Then the sound of faint footsteps echoed from the far side of the barn. They were light, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the figure pause. It turned its head, scanning the darkness, its smile faltering slightly. From the shadows, a new figure emerged, one that made Kazilia's blood run cold. It was her grandmother, Kazilia Sr., the matriarch of the Gruber family. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Her grandmother's eyes were vacant, her movements stiff and unnatural, as if she were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The old woman's face was twisted into a grotesque mask of anger and grief, her mouth opening and closing silently as she moved closer. The closer she got, the more Kazilia realized that this was not her grandmother. Not anymore. The figure that had once been Kazilia Sr. stopped in front of the monstrous entity that had terrorized their family. The two stood there face to face, locked in a silent confrontation. And then, to Kazilia's shock, her grandmother spoke. "You will not take them!" she rasped, her voice low and hollow. "Not tonight." The monstrous figure snarled, its claws twitching in anticipation. But the old woman didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her vacant eyes fixed on the creature, and raised a hand, her fingers crooked and gnarled with age. The creature hesitated, a flicker of something, fear, passing across its face. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, it seemed uncertain, almost as if it recognized the old woman and the power she held. Without warning, Kazilia Sr. lunged forward, her hand gripping the creature's wrist with surprising strength. The air around them seemed to vibrate, a low hum filling the barn as the two forces, one ancient and malevolent, the other old and resolute, struggled for dominance. The creature roared, its form flickering and distorting as it tried to free itself from the old woman's grip. But Kazilia Sr. held fast, her expression one of grim determination. "Go!" she suddenly screamed, her voice cracking with the effort. "Run, now!" Kazilia didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Joseph and pulled him to his feet, pushing him toward the barn doors. They stumbled through the hay, their feet slipping as they raced toward the exit. Behind them, the sound of the struggle intensified, the creature's roars mingling with the old woman's guttural chants. As they reached the doors, Kazilia turned back one last time. Her grandmother's face was contorted with pain, but there was something else there too. Something almost peaceful. It was as if she had finally found the strength to do what needed to be done. The creature let out one final, deafening scream as its form collapsed in on itself, dissolving into a thick black mist. The mist swirled around the old woman, wrapping her in its dark tendrils, but she didn't let go. She held on until the very end, her eyes locked on Kazilia's. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the mist and the old woman were gone. The barn was silent once more, the only sound the soft, ragged breathing of the children as they stood frozen in the doorway. Kazilia felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't move. She couldn't. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. But she knew she had to keep going. She had to get Joseph to safety. With a final shaky breath, she turned and pushed open the barn doors. The night air was cold and crisp, the stars glittering overhead as if nothing had happened. But Kazilia knew better. The horrors of that night would stay with her forever. She took Joseph's hand and led him out into the night, the two of them disappearing into the darkness as the barn loomed silently behind them. As they walked, Kazilia couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, something that had survived the old woman's sacrifice. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the creature's glowing eyes staring back at her from the shadows. But there was nothing, only the cold, empty night. Or so she thought. As they made their way down the long, winding path that led away from the farmstead, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, barely audible whisper. It was a sound that sent shivers down Kazilia's spine, a sound she had heard before. And as she hurried Joseph along, her heart pounding in her chest, she couldn't help but wonder if the nightmare was truly over, or if it had only just begun. The wind carried the whisper, growing louder with each gust until it was almost clear enough to understand. It was a voice, low and guttural, filled with a malevolent glee. You cannot kill what has never lived. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the woods that surrounded the Hinterkaifeck farmstead, something watched them go, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, waiting.